right now on Matter of Fact.
Does anger sort of morph into exhaustion and you actually run the risk of just wearing people out?
What's the ground game for motivating minority voters in the midterms?
Occasionally, anger is enough.
Plus, the swing vote both parties are ignoring.
Could Republicans make more headway with Latinos?
Latinos can't tell the difference between a donkey and an elephant. Both parties have done a terrible, terrible job.
And can John McCain's legacy inspire a new generation of mavericks?
We stand for truth against falsehood, freedom against tyranny, right against injustice.
I'm Soledad O'Brien. Welcome to Matter of Fact. With the midterms less than 2 weeks away, efforts to get out the vote are being met with accusations of voter suppression. From purging voter rolls to reducing the number of polling places to requiring photo IDs, several states like Alabama, Tennessee, and Ohio are making it harder to vote. Georgia is at the center of the fight over tactics targeting minority voters. Democrat Stacey Abrams, who could become the first black female governor in America, is in a tight race against Republican Brian Kemp. Now, Kemp is also the Secretary of State, which means he oversees the election. His office has been accused of rejecting more than 50,000 absentee ballot requests, nearly 70% of those from black voters. Many groups are on the ground in Georgia and other states, all trying to make sure that all eligible voters are able to cast a ballot come November 6th. Arisha Hatch is with Color of Change. So nice to have you.
I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, thank you. I
for having
appreciate
me.
that. So let's talk about what motivates African Americans to come out to the polls. What would you say are the main things?
Yeah, we've been hosting brunches with our members all across the country this year, tens of thousands of members, and they're talking about what are the challenges that impede their life. And we hear things about education, we hear about healthcare, we hear about having a fair wage, a living wage. These are the things that black folks are talking about in addition to some of the criminal justice issues that have been at the forefront with the police violence conversations.
There have been tremendous gains in turnout for black women. They're really leading the way in a lot of ways. Why is that?
I think we come from a history in which voting mattered, in which we saw our relatives, our family members, our grandparents actually have to sacrifice in order to vote.
Let's talk about anger. The NAACP did a poll over the summer, and they found that 77% of blacks think that Trump's statements and policies will set race relations back. That's compared with 51% of white people who were polled. Can anger drive people to polls? Is it enough?
I think occasionally anger is enough, but we've been really focused on black joy as a motivator. Oftentimes we'll have candidates come in who don't always speak to our values or don't always reflect our families, but we've been really trying to center black joy as the vision. This is where we want to head, and black joy might mean a lot of different things for different people, but for most of me—
I've never heard anybody in up to the midterms talk about black joy. What do you mean?
Well, for me, black joy is the feeling that my family has when they feel like anything is possible. When they feel like they get a fair shot in life, when they feel like they're treated equally. So
it sounds like you're saying a positive campaign as opposed to, we're so furious, we're going to run to the polls. Do you think you'll ever be able to get the voter participation that existed for African Americans under Obama?
I'm a pessimist in most things, but I'm an optimist in terms of black voter participation. And I want us to shift our mindset from thinking that black voter participation during Barack Obama's election was the high watermark. It is a new ceiling. But I believe it's possible, and we talk to voters all the time that were so disenchanted that they didn't vote for Barack Obama.
Well, Colin Kaepernick, not voting for Barack Obama, but I mean his message about don't vote, he wasn't the only one who was sort of saying, like, listen, abstain altogether because the system is rigged, if you will. That's a problematic message, but I can't even say I understand it because I think it's I guess I'm just never going to tell anybody not to vote ever.
Yeah, I think it reflects a lot of people in this country, not just Black people, who feel really disenchanted by politics. I don't think it's the most responsible message. I actually do believe if, as Black people, we can get 100% of the vote, if we can get all of the eligible voters to come out, then we can actually change the landscape. But we're trying to sort of change that conversation and say for Black folks, like, this is not the time.
Don't sit this one out.
Don't sit this one out. Like, there's harm reduction that we have to do. Even if we can't get to the exact Black joy vision that we see for the world, it can get worse.
I know you said you're a pessimist. I'm actually an optimist, believe it or not, and pretty consistently an optimist. What are your thoughts on where the midterms will go in terms of African-American participation?
One of the few things that I'm an optimist about is just the power and the resilience of Black people. And so I am hopeful for and expecting to see not only a blue wave, but also a Black wave in this upcoming cycle because there's so much at stake. There's so much at stake.
We'll see, won't we? Arisha Hatch from Color of Change. So nice to have you.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Next on Matter of Fact, are Democrats off message when it comes to Latino voters?
Immigration is not the most important issue to Latinos.
Plus a posthumous plea for unity from America's most famous maverick.
We cannot give up on ourselves and on each other.
And
I'm protecting everybody. I want to protect our country.
but will it come at the expense of protections for transgender people?
The Latino vote has been credited with making the difference in recent elections and electing George W. Bush in 2004 and Barack Obama in 2012. There are 29 million Latinos who are eligible to vote in the United States, and while most are in California and Texas and Florida, North Carolina is also seeing a big increase in the number of eligible Latino voters. But despite these increases, the number of Latinos who actually vote in midterms has been declining since 2006. Chiqui Cartagena is an expert in understanding the Latino market. She's also the author of 2 books on the Latino boom. It's nice to have you, Chiqui.
Thank you.
So give me the sense of the Latino voter.
Well, as you well said, 29 million are eligible, but let me put that number in perspective. There are 60 million Latinos in this country. 85%, by the way, are citizens. The other 15% are on the way of becoming citizens. But only 20 million of the 29 million eligible are actually registered to vote. And of those 20 million, 20% of those are very, very young, between the ages of 18 and 29, which, as you know, younger voters tend not to vote so much. The real Latino voters tend to be older and tend to be more Spanish dominant.
Everyone says this election will hinge on voter turnout.
Yeah. Yes.
And yet, Latino voter turnout is consistently low. People predict high, people say this election's gonna be the one, and Latinos do not turn out to vote. Why not?
When Latinos are engaged, they actually do vote. And we've seen that in many cases. Problem is that as of September 25th, 6 out of 10 Latinos had not been contacted by either party, by any committee, or by any candidate. So if they don't know what the issues are, if they don't know what the candidates are representing, they're not going to go vote. They're scared not to do the right thing.
There was a sense when the rhetoric in the 2016 presidential election was so harsh around Latinos that it would push Latinos to go to the polls. It didn't happen.
You would think that, Trump calling us rapists and the reality is that immigration is not the most important issue to Latinos. And so education, healthcare, jobs, and the economy are the more important issues. So they want to hear candidates talking about those things. Immigration really is an American problem, not a Latino problem, right? Latinos are involved because of the anti-Latino rhetoric, but most Latinos are citizens, and therefore they're going to vote on pocketbook issues.
You've said that Democrats take Latinos for granted. And
Yes.
by the way, the Democrats on the record will say that's just not true.
Democrats and Republicans are both using the same playbook that they were using 50 years ago. And unfortunately, the demographics have changed, right? Today, how can you run a campaign in California where 50% of your electorate is Latino and not run a Hispanic campaign?
Could Republicans make more headway with Latinos than they're making right now?
They could and they should. Latinos can't tell the difference between a donkey and an elephant. Both parties have done a terrible, terrible job of speaking to Latinos about what they stand for, not who they're against or what they're against, what they stand for.
There is a theory that says that people put their energy and their money into going back to those people who consistently turn out at elections, right? So part of the problem is if you haven't consistently voted, then everybody says, well, let's not put our energy into this demographic because we've seen historically they don't vote.
That's right.
So then they're ignored again and again and again. Is that essentially what's happening?
It's a catch-22. Because Latinos are low propensity voters, they don't get the attention they need from the campaign. Since they don't get the attention they need for the campaign, they become low propensity voters. So somebody's got to break that vicious cycle. And it's going to take somebody with cojones to say, whether that's the DNC or the RNC or both, to say, I want these voters and I'm going to go get them. I'm going to start now. We've also seen that early engagement helps. When Obama was running his re-election campaign in 2012, he was known as the deporter-in-chief, right? Well, he started in April his positive messaging using people, messengers, Latinos who could talk about what he was doing for the Latino community. And by the time the election came, he won 72% of the vote. But he started off really upside down with the Latino population, and he was able to fix it by continuous messaging and positive messaging about what he was doing for the country.
Chiqui Cartagena, so nice to have you. Thanks for your analysis.
Thank you.
When we come back, what does it mean to be a maverick?
A spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance.
I had thought the videos, the Maverick videos, would be like a call to come and join the GOP, and they're not that at all.
No.
Can the late Senator John McCain inspire a bipartisanship movement before one of the most divisive midterms? And a Broadway star gets the coffee business brewing again in Puerto Rico. And in 2 weeks, a special edition of Matter of Fact from the U.S.-Mexico border. We head to a Texas town fighting back against President Trump's border wall.
The late Senator John McCain was known as a maverick. He earned the title because he was a conservative Republican who was not afraid to challenge his own party or even reach across the aisle for support from Democrats. The McCain Institute is using the senator's own words to encourage a new generation of mavericks to come out and vote on November 6th. Take a listen.
We stand for truth against falsehood, freedom against tyranny, right against injustice, hope against despair.
The initiative is called Mavericks Needed. Kurt Volker is the executive director of the McCain Institute. He's also the former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Mr. Ambassador, it's so nice to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
Tell me the agenda, the mission of the Institute.
Well, the mission is to advance character-driven leadership. That's how we've been around for 6 years now, trying to identify emerging leaders in the U.S., around the world, train, network, equip, and inspire them to show the courage and integrity that a good leader should show, and that we feel Senator McCain exemplified.
What's a maverick? By definition.
Maverick is someone who is, just as you said, willing to buck a trend, willing to do what they think is right, even if it may hurt them, but willing to stand up and try to fix something.
You've said it's not about left or right, it's about right or wrong.
Yeah, and what we're not saying that left is wrong, by the way, either. What we're saying is you got to take a stand on principles and on issues. What is it that you see happening? How should we go about that? Be honest about it. Don't make it a partisan fight. Try to actually take personal responsibility as a citizen. Get engaged. And one of the things you can do to be an engaged citizen is to vote. And we're not saying how to vote. People should make up their own minds. But get engaged and be responsible.
I had thought the videos, the Maverick videos, would be like a call to come and join the GOP, and they're not that at all.
No,
and in fact, some of them, I don't even think feel like GOP. I mean, they're very, very diverse. I think that's kind of been an issue a little bit. They talk a lot about decency and voters' rights. I don't think that those are things that either party at this moment is standing on.
Right.
That surprised me.
Well, we're not trying to be political here. Obviously, Senator McCain was a conservative Republican, as you said, but he also stood for a lot of other things that transcend that. Personal courage, integrity, leadership, these core values matter. They are what make us Americans, that our country was founded on these core values. It's what we believe in our hearts. And so we need to have a campaign to reignite that, if you will.
There was a time when you'd be rewarded, if you will, for reaching across the aisle, for being thoughtful, for having character, that those things were actually truly, I think, genuinely seen as a plus. And now I think it's fair to say that those things would not be seen as a plus in the media as well. The media would see that as weakness.
I think it's become a very polarized environment. And I think most people are afraid that if they did try to work with someone from the other party or bring a bipartisan coalition together, they would be attacked for that. I hope that we can overcome that.
We're at a time when thinking about elected officials as being people of character and integrity and all the words that you use, having personal courage.
Right.
Those don't roll off the tongue, to be honest, at this time in American politics, right this moment. As you see this younger crop, both on the GOP side, on the Democrat side, independents, are you feeling hopeful? What do you see?
I am hopeful. I am hopeful.
Like really hopeful, or just
really
because you're an optimistic
really
guy?
No, I am an optimistic person, but I'm also really hopeful because I don't think the country has fundamentally changed in terms of its core character and values as a country. Americans are fair-minded. Americans do want freedom and democracy. They want security. They want economic opportunity. And they want to get along with other people. So I think the core values of the country are still there.
I like the sound of that. Ambassador Kurt Volker, nice to have you. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Soledad.
You bet.
Coming up next.
As your president, I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens.
Is President Trump bringing that promise to a halt and putting transgender people at risk? Plus, a venti-sized effort to plant seeds of hope.
Starbucks also chipped in, donating almost $500,000 and 2 million coffee seeds. Now to a weekly feature we like to call We're Paying Attention Even If You're Too Busy. A proposition on the ballot in Massachusetts could have repercussions for the transgender community around the country. The measure could repeal a state law that bans discrimination based on gender identity in public businesses like hotels and restaurants and even hospitals. Republican Governor Charlie Baker signed the bill into law back in 2016. Since then, opponents of the bill have tried to overturn it. Prop 3 is their latest attempt. 3 recent polls show that more than 70% of voters in Massachusetts support upholding the bill. Massachusetts is one of 19 states, plus Washington, D.C., to ban discrimination based on gender identity. The vote comes as the Trump administration is reportedly looking to change how gender is legally defined in America, basing gender identity on a person's sex at birth, basically male or female only, which would officially deny that transgender people even exist. That has prompted protests in front of the White House and around the country. As for the president, last week he would not confirm any specifics and only said he was looking at several different options.
When we return, he broke barriers on Broadway. Now, can Lin-Manuel conquer the coffee business?
Coffee growers need help, and so we're going to have their backs.
Finally, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico last year, the devastation also hit almost every part of the island's economy, including coffee. The storm wiped out 80% of Puerto Rico's coffee crops. But there's a new initiative to bring the coffee business back, and it's getting some help from one of Puerto Rico's biggest supporters, Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of the hit musical Hamilton. His parents are from Puerto Rico, and he's helped raise millions of dollars to rebuild nurseries and help farmers better protect themselves from climate disasters. Starbucks also chipped in, donating almost $500,000 and 2 million coffee seeds. It's the latest effort by Miranda to help the island. He's also taking Hamilton to Puerto Rico in January. It's a limited 3-week run to help raise money for the island. And Miranda has confirmed that he will reprise his role as Alexander Hamilton. All the profits from the performances will go toward a fund that's dedicated to preserving the arts in Puerto Rico. That's it for this week's edition of Matter of Fact, and we will see you right back here next week.